All right. G'day, g'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis, the podcast where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name is Pietro. This is Max. How you doing, Max?
Hey, Pietro. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm very good. We've got another fantastic guest tonight. We always have fantastic guests.
I've actually
never
got
had a...
Sorry to interrupt you. I've actually got a glass of whiskey in tribute to our guest. I don't normally drink whiskey, or scotch. So that might give anyone a little clue before you introduce him.
Yeah, you brought a fantastic guest of your own there, Max, with your drink of choice. So our guest today is one of the absolute heroes of the protest movement against lockdowns, mandates, and even a long time beforehand against general government overreach. He's a political commentator and director, most recently known for his documentary Battleground Melbourne, which documents the whole COVID hysteria around the last 2 years and what it meant to Melburnians and police reaction and government and all the rest of it. So if you haven't checked that out yet, I suggest you do at the end of this podcast. But without further ado, I'll invite our guest on, Mr. Topher Field. How you doing, Topher?
Pietro, thank you so much. And Max, you're making me feel bad because, look, I always, whenever I'm the one being interviewed, I have to make a choice. Do I go to the garage and smoke one of my signature cigars and drink whiskey, of course, or do I stay inside where I can't smoke a cigar and inevitably I end up drinking wine? And I went for the latter today. Yes, that is a massive glass of wine. I should not have poured as much as I did, but I'm a naughty boy. And so here you are drinking whiskey and making me look like a schmuck.
By the end of this episode, I want you simultaneously drinking whiskey, wine, and smoking a cigar.
Wow. Okay, so firstly, my landlord will throw us out of the house. And secondly, the whiskey and wine simultaneously will cause me to throw up. But you know what? I'm still game.
It's all content. That's what we want.
It's all content.
You can tell right there that Max has never done whiskey and wine before because he didn't know about that little particular trick. Anyway, we're learning. We're learning.
Yeah.
So Topher, let's get cracking. So many of our viewers obviously will be familiar with you, your activism during the protest movement, also Battleground Melbourne, of course. You've been a libertarian for quite a long time, though. So basically, tell us a story of how you came to it.
Sure. I was raised as a cookie cutter conservative. I've become a libertarian from a very conservative background, and I remain personally, at a personal level, I remain very conservative. If someone asks me about the choices that I would make for myself, the answers are very conservative. The difference is that I don't think that I have the right to force my conservatism on somebody else via the government. That's what makes someone a libertarian. So growing up, I make this joke, but it's only a half joke. Growing up, there was the Trinity. There was the Godhead Trinity. There was God the Father, there was God the Son, and there was God the Johnny Howard. Okay. And it's halfway a joke and it's halfway really not, right? Johnny Howard, nothing he could do was in any way wrong. That was kind of, my parents didn't intend to raise me that way, but that's the reality of it. Even down to things like the gun ban, 1996, when all the semi-automatic rifles were banned. And I sat there, and how old was I? I was 14 years of age. And I was looking forward to 2 years' time when I was old enough to get a junior shooter's license. And I was going to be able to get a little 22 semi-automatic rifle called a Raven, right? And it had a pistol grip, and it was semi-automatic, and it was 22. So it was great for rabbits and that sort of stuff. And it was like sexy. And I was in love with this thing. And then John Howard says, hey, we have to take all the guns. And I was like, oh, man. But Johnny Howard said it, so it must be right. Okay, and honestly, I'm not even exaggerating. I wish I was caricaturing myself because it's embarrassing, but it's actually true, right? And I went, okay, well, hey, he knows what's best, and that was really how I was raised. And it was in my very early 20s, 21, 22, 23. I spent a couple of years in the Army Reserves. I went through a recruit course. I got all my qualifications. I got all my infantry qualifications bar one. They didn't have the rocket launchers, the dummy rounds for us to get the rocket launcher qualification. But barring that one qualification, I was ready for deployment. I'd passed all my fitness tests, all the rest of it. Spent about 2.5 years in the reserves. Why only 2.5 years? Most people spend longer. Well, because it was that time in the reserves that was like I would liken it to the Wizard of Oz when they saw behind that curtain and they saw the little man with the big speaker and the microphone, and their whole worldview changed in that moment. And their whole view of Oz changed in this short space of time. That's what the reserves were for me, because as a Christian conservative cookie cutter guy, the military is up on this pedestal. You think that these people are somehow a cut above, and in many ways they are, in terms of physicality, in terms of their fitness, in terms of their training, oftentimes in terms of their morals as well. This is something that gets missed a lot when you get the ABC piling and what have you. These are some truly exceptional people, but the organization is not exceptional. The organization is very, very mundane. It is exactly what you would expect of a massive bureaucracy filled with tens of thousands of people. And I saw it with my own eyes when I was just a lowly infantry private. That's all I ever was, right? But I saw it with my own eyes, and it really bent my worldview. It really bent my perception, because for so long I'd idolized the military. And these people were so ordinary and were prone to making such bad decisions. I won't give you specific examples, but I'll say I saw the effect of, my sergeant was hungry and he made this terrible decision because he was hungry and he wanted food. He was hangry, right?
The stakes are quite high as well.
Sorry?
The stakes are quite high here to be making mistakes.
Sure. I wasn't on deployment. I mean, I'm just talking about exercises, right? Okay. I have no cred in that regard. I never deployed. I never fought. I never anything. But I just watched it happen. And it broke my idolization, really, of what that was. And that was actually the beginning of my journey away from conservatism and towards libertarianism. I give this crappy analogy, and it is crappy. And you've been warned, it's crappy. If I give you this analogy and you go, well, that's a crappy analogy. Hey, I told you right up front, it was crappy, right? Changing someone's mind, getting someone to change what they believe. It's like going out and collecting oysters or pippies, right? The hardest thing in that journey of collecting oysters is cracking them off the rock where they're attached, right? You get in the car and you drive to the beach, whichever beach you're going to go. You wade out there into the pier. And the hardest thing you will do is crack them off that pier, off that rock, whatever it is. And then you drop them in the bucket and you stick the bucket in the back of the car and you drive 100 kilometers back home. That's easy. The hard part was getting them to let go of the position that they already held. And the same is true of ideas. Getting someone to let go of the position they already hold is the hardest part. And once they get cracked off that pier, they can travel a long way in a short space of time. And it was my couple of years in the Army Reserves as a nobody. I'm not claiming any status out of that, but that was the reality. I spent a couple of years as a nobody in the Army Reserves, and that was that cracking off the pier. That was me going, hang on, what I believe is wrong. And from there, my journey towards libertarianism started.
That's I actually see like a lot of parallels there, because so that loss of faith in the reserves initially is kind of the loss of faith that we need a lot of people to have broadly, of not just the government necessarily, because the government's kind of almost this abstract entity to a lot of people, but like politicians themselves, right? The people.
Yeah, sorry, hang on, Pietro, I have to interrupt you. You're not questioning the experts, are you? You're not saying that the experts might be wrong. I mean, that would be sacrilege, Pietro. You wouldn't do that, would you?
No, well, not even the experts, like the people who choose the experts and that kind of, like, it's this weird double think kind of thing that we have in our brains, to quote 1984, is that simultaneously, like, the people I know, I wouldn't necessarily trust them with everything important about my life because they have faults, and I see that, and no one I've ever met is without fault. And yet,
except me. Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot the esteemed company that we were with. It's all right. My fault's more than make up for your lack of faults. But,
sure.
This notion that, these people are without faults, and yet, because there is some sort of democratic, as if democracy is this, high pedestal of virtue thing.
Yeah.
But these people cannot be without fault. In fact, it's impossible for them to have ulterior motives or anything. And any sort of suggestion of that is.
Can I correct you a little bit there, Pietro? I understand where you're going with that. But the statist mind, the state worshipping mind, doesn't actually think that the people that work for the state are without fault. What they believe is that the system into which those people have been placed somehow means that their faults cannot possibly affect their work.
Yeah.
It's this really weird thing. I mean, I'm in wholehearted agreement with you in the principle of it, but there's this weird psychological disconnect. As soon as someone holds a government title, well, the chief health officer, if I went to my doctor and they said something silly, I would go and get a second opinion because my doctor can be questioned. But the chief health officer, well, of course, I know they're human. Of course, they can make mistakes. Yes. I know all of that. But they're the chief health officer. They must be right. There's this really weird worship that happens when they achieve that position, that title.
Well, as we've seen, like especially in the state Labor government, though, if you question somebody high up, you disappear. But
Max, who would do that? Who would be foolish and faithless enough to question the government? I would never do such a thing. And I tell you, both of you, I assure you, I would never do such a thing. Daniel Andrews and his chief health officers have been right about everything, always and always will be.
All right, now we're in the good books with ACO. Let's talk shit.
Yeah.
I've actually seen a documentary that goes for about, I think, an hour and a half or 2 hours that says completely the opposite about you, Topher, and that every statement that you just made there is completely false.
That wasn't a documentary. It was fiction.
Look, in the words of Donald Trump, it must be fake news.
Fake news that you produced yourself.
Hey,
that's dangerous. Now we're in
splitting hairs, still fake news.
Well, now we're really in clown world. Who am I talking to? I actually think you're right that when I was saying that people look at politicians as this kind of faultless thing, I was kind of thinking actually most specifically about a couple of politicians in particular, for which there is this kind of adoration by the public. But it's a weird, obviously Dan himself and chief health officer and whatnot. There's a few of them that are untouchable, and in certain circles they certainly are untouchable. But there's this weird other disconnect that Australians especially have, which is, I suppose, more to your point, which is like politicians, like, yuck, I wouldn't trust a politician with, anything, with my grocery list. And yet the state is this, this entity. I'm saying you're right. Well done, Tony. I'm saying you're right. The state is this entity.
And can I give credit where it's due here? It was Helen Dale, the author, the British Australian author. She split her time between England and Australia. She was the one that really highlighted this for me. She wasn't the one that came up with the phrase, and I can never remember the person that did, but I remember the person that introduced me to this phrase. She said, and she was quoting somebody else. She said, the problem with Australians is not that they're descended from convicts, but that they are descended from jailers. And that came out in Victoria during COVID. That came out so strongly. We are descended from jailers. We are descended from soldiers. We're descended from the people that were tasked with maintaining law and order, no matter what the people wanted. And I feel that so deeply now, because it cuts to the very sense of my own identity as an Australian. I'm fifth generation Australian on both sides of my family, right? I'm as Aussie as you can get without being Indigenous. The only way to be more Aussie than I am is to be Indigenous, right? And to have been here before white man arrived on this continent. That's the only way you can be more Australian than I am. And this quote cuts to the very heart of my identity. We are descended not only from the convicts, but also from the jailers. And unfortunately, based on the evidence in Victoria over the last couple of years, the jailer instinct is winning.
It also feeds the rebellion instinct a bit too, though, doesn't it?
Look, I would have hoped so. And prior to COVID, I would have predicted so. I really would have. But COVID has shaken my whole sense of identity, my whole sense of nationality, all of my expectations of my fellow Australians. It's shaken everything. There is nothing left untouched by the last couple of years. And, I had someone chatting with me the other day. They randomly ran into me at a coffee shop and, Topher, hey. And we got into a good chat. And they were sharing with me, I'll use the word they because I don't want to reveal whether it was a he or a she or where we were or who they might have been. They were sharing with me how incredibly exhausted they were after all of the COVID stuff, the lockdowns, the protests. They'd been there at the protests, etc. And I said, well, why wouldn't you be exhausted? This hasn't just been physically fatiguing and psychologically fatiguing, but absolutely everything that you took for granted about your own sense of identity and who you are as an Australian, all of that has been radically changed. Because pre-COVID, I would have predicted that Australians would never have stood for what we've just lived through. But I now know that a majority of people will not only stand for it, they will actually dob you in if you're one of the lawbreakers. That's not something that I expected 3 years ago. That's been a radical shift. And coming to terms with that is an exhausting and a challenging thing to do. Australians are not who we pretend to the world that we are. We love the Crocodile Dundee stereotype. We love the fact that Americans think that we're all Crocodile Dundee. We play into that. We leverage that. We leverage the crap out of that. It's a lie. We are the most cowardly, the most easily frightened, and the most obedient. You know, something that struck me as I was there in the protests, the anti-lockdown protests during 2020, 2021, it's been funny. Facebook's been feeding me memories from a year ago recently. And of course, a year ago now is just as we made the transition in Melbourne away from the protests that the police were violently cracking down on to the protests that were peaceful. And I'm reading what I said back then. I'm like, damn, that guy's got balls. It doesn't even feel like it was me. Right? But I'm looking at what we went through. I'm looking at what we did. I'm looking at what we allowed. And I just feel like we owe the world an apology because we've lied to them. We told them we were something different. We told them we were something better. And the truth is now being shown. We're not.
I think, Leah, one other thing that we Australians like to show everyone else that we are is this kind of like the Ned Kelly anti-authoritarian, and like when help your neighbor against the police officer or whatever, like that kind of subversive anti-authoritarian thing, and that's demonstrably untrue now. And what's more, I'd say, is that we saw like we're also so easily propagandized because the rest of the world had a lot more in terms of what to fear regarding COVID, especially those first few waves where, it was really unknown. And we didn't have any of that until a long time after, until it was really easy to get your hands on a set of data that could quite easily explain, how wary and what to do and what to be afraid of. And yet, we were so easily propagandized, and it was interesting. I don't know if this was your experience of the protests and the protest kind of communities. It was a lot of international, European, Eastern European, especially. It was overrepresented by those.
I literally nearly said that, and then I changed course with what I was saying in my previous comment to you literally like 2 minutes ago. There were two segments of society that I believe were heavily overrepresented in the protests. Number one was Christians. Okay, it or not, in my opinion, Christians, Bible-believing, Bible-bashing, Jesus freaks were overrepresented, of which I'm one, by the way, were overrepresented in the movement. The other segment that was clearly overrepresented in the movement was first and second generation immigrants. People who themselves came from, whether it's Romania or some Eastern Bloc country, or people whose parents came. They were heavily overrepresented in the movement because they recognized, either in their own experience or in the stories that their fathers and their mothers told them, they recognized the similarities. And the people who weren't there were mostly people like me, fourth and fifth generation Aussies. We've had it too good for too long. We think that this prosperity is normal. We take it for granted. We think that it's the default. Yeah. And we don't realize how incredibly lucky we've been.
We've spoken about this in previous episodes, remembering back to the protests, and the people that were represented are the people that I would listen to the most. The ones who have escaped communism from Eastern Europe. There were plenty of Viets there as well. Chinese. And they're the people who I would listen to before anybody else, because they're the ones that have seen it firsthand, 100%. Have escaped it, and they're the ones that want to stop it from happening again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
So I'm also Bible bashing Christian. I'm also first generation Australian. From my parents are from Italy, although I don't know so much a credit that second reason. My family has been not under the foot of the state for a number of generations. But I would say I would accredit the under the communist influence or fear of the state from other countries. I think is easy to explain. If your parents or your grandparents know that the state is not always benevolent, you can see when a dictator or a dictator type or a state is growing and taking too much power. The Christian element, I would say, is we've talked about this with another guest, but I think it's worth mentioning again, is that when Christians, I think, were enormously overrepresented, because to a Christian, the highest authority is never going to be the state. It's going to be God. They belong to God before they belong to anyone else. Whereas someone, the fourth or fifth generation, typically like nominally Christian or not, or atheist or agnostic or whatever, that devotion, that human need for something to look up to, for something to be devoted to, by default is replaced by the state. And I think that, and so for that reason alone, as soon as the state is telling you this is a problem and we are the only solution, and these are the heathens that are, fighting against your well-being and putting you in danger, it's not a big jump for the average person to then turn against their neighbors in a way that, and I'm not necessarily even just saying Christians, anyone of faith or anyone who is removed enough in their own mind from devotion to the state, wouldn't have made that jump so easily.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there. Have you seen the message that I gave 2 Sundays ago at my church, which was about the government and God?
I have not, but
and government taking the place of God. So look, I'm not going to reiterate it here, but shameless self-promotion, jump onto my Facebook page or my YouTube channel at Topher Field, scroll back a little bit. You'll find the message that I gave at my home church about government versus God, or government taking the place of God. And this is exactly it, Pietro. You're exactly right. Humans love to believe, we love to believe, was it Nietzsche who said, we've killed God, or I've killed God? Might have been him, might have been somebody else, it's all fuzzy. But fundamentally, we love to believe this idea that God is no longer necessary, that he was invented by primitive people. We've evolved past that. We're better than that now. We don't need this idea of God anymore. And what that leads to is this direct idolatry, this direct worship of government, because whether you like it or not, I'm sorry to break it to you, human psyche needs a higher power. We need a power that we defer to make decisions that feel like they are beyond our psyche. Decisions about what is morally right, what is morally wrong. And when we kill God, not that we can literally, but when we, in our ideas, we say, okay, God is dead, right? Well, now we need something to take its place. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is people who believed themselves to be incredibly intellectual and incredibly intelligent and erudite, having no need for God, have very much placed the government in God's place, and given the government power to dictate, theology. Not that they would necessarily recognize theology when they see it, but it is their theology. It's their fundamental worldview. It's their view about the meaning of life, the purpose for which we are here, what we should actually strive for and try and achieve while we are here. This is no longer being dictated by their belief about a God. This is being dictated by their belief about government. And we are very much in an age, in my opinion, where we are seeing idolatry. It's my view that the Judeo-Christian God is real and does exist, and that the worship of a false God, an alternate God to that, is idolatry. And that's what I believe we're seeing now in our culture, is a worship of a false God in the form of this sort of atheist replacement God, which in practice takes the form of government.
So question for you both.
Sure.
As someone who would identify as an atheist and also hates the government, who should I be worshipping? What should I be worshipping? I've got values I live by, but you're saying there needs to be one single greater power.
Number one, get right with God before it's too late. And you don't know when it's going to be too late. But putting aside my faith, putting aside my Christian worldview, okay? You would understand me when I say that there are places where the government should not be allowed to go. There are places where the government does not actually have jurisdiction. And my question for you as an atheist would be, why not? Why doesn't the government have jurisdiction over those areas? Who defined the areas over which government can or cannot have jurisdiction? Now, I have my own answer for that, and my answer doesn't necessarily invoke God. And that's going to come out in a series of videos that I'm preparing for early next year, which is to do with the foundations of liberty, the foundations of freedom, and the ideas of freedom, which actually, I don't actually reference God at all in this entire series, right? So I'm not saying that your answer to that has to invoke God necessarily, but I do think you need to have a God-level answer to this question. Why doesn't the government have jurisdiction? Why can't someone else or a collection of other people tell you what you can and can't do with those parts of your life? Because you and I would agree that there are areas where the government cannot tread, right?
Yes.
Why not?
Ooh,
that's the question.
That's a tough one. I suppose that comes back to us asking for your opinions on the third option.
But why does another human being's opinion have any bearing on your opinion? I mean, they have no greater jurisdiction than you. And so we very quickly run into a question about God, the existence of God, the nature of God, the rules that God has set, and you know, whether or not that even exists as a construct. These are the things that we run into very quickly when we as libertarians start to make this assertion that there are places where the government cannot go. I'm not saying you have to agree with me. I'm just saying these are questions that we have to have answers to.
Yeah, right.
If I could answer the question in a slightly different direction, because as you know, most of my friends aren't Christian, and I don't purport to have any sort of hope of converting most of them, nor do I really have any great desire to try to, because you know, it's not particularly popular to bring up Christianity at a party or at many of the social encounters where
you're not wrong.
I might see people.
You're not wrong.
In terms of like how to answer that question, like, well, let's look at the consequences of having a society that is based on Christianity and a society that is based on, you know, devotion to the state. Like it's night and day, a society that values, you know, the sovereign individual and looking after the community versus a society that values the expansion of the state and, you know, this vague idea of like the collective good above the idea of the individual. And that is like, if, even just looking at it from a completely like utilitarian point of view, one of those is distinctly better than the other. So if, you know, to answer your question, if I had to choose one of the two, Topher's about to butt in. He's about to burst. I, you know, even as an atheist, I would rather a society that is around God.
I agree with that.
I've turned red. Which I'm always red. I'm always red to some degree, but I've turned really, really red. Utilitarian is a dirty word in my view.
Yeah.
Utilitarianism is only useful after you've gone through a values-based, a principles-based analysis. Utilitarianism is useful when you as a private property owner are sitting there saying, what's the best way to spend the available budget that I have on improving my property? That's where utilitarianism comes in. From a government perspective, utilitarianism only comes in at the very end of the decision-making process. Everything before that has to be about values, about principles, about human rights. Because no matter what the utilitarian argument, it never justifies a government violating human rights. And this is important to me. The reason why I turned red is because essentially Daniel Andrews' argument for violating our human rights during COVID was a utilitarian one. It's going to save lives. It will do the greatest good to the greatest number of people. That's a utilitarian holy grail.
Yeah.
Right. But he violated human rights in the process. And we have to be really careful when we invoke utilitarianism to make sure that that utilitarian argument is downstream of the human rights, the principles argument that it must happen first.
If I said the utilitarianism to say, you know, even from their utilitarian, like, you know, even from a utilitarian argument, which is what, as you correctly mentioned, they tend to point. Of course, we look at the individual, the individual sovereign over his own or her own life. In fact, I would say that a lot of us got bogged down in a lot of the arguments against mandates and against lockdowns in being forced to make utilitarian arguments, in which we were also correct. That's the extra cherry on top, is that actually we were also correct on the utilitarian argument, but that is kind of that wasn't necessarily a given, because the correct argument from someone who values individual liberty above this status notion of the collective, the correct argument is, even if it does save lives, or even if it does do some good, it doesn't give any being or any entity the power over another one to determine the direction of their lives.
Well answered, Pietro. I was reaching for the leave button. I was reaching for the cancel exit button, but you know what? I'll hold off for a moment longer. Well answered.
That's good. That's the closest we've come to a bit of a debate or anything. It's all been too polite on this podcast.
Yeah, no, you can't have that. You've got to have a contest of ideas.
Meanwhile, I've been sitting here questioning my whole life after Topher's in-depth question before. I'm still working out my answer.
Sorry, I have that effect on people.
The deepest question I've ever been asked in my life.
Max is mid-conversion over there, and we're biffing out over.
Pietro, you and I both know that everyone is mid-conversion. They just don't know it yet.
That's true. Let's take a bit of a different direction, because I'm very interested in that sign that you have behind you there, Topher. No, on the other side, the inflation is theft, because just early today, you've been in this game for a lot longer than us, and in fact, early today I was rewatching this really good taxation video that you made about 10 years ago.
Back when I was young and skinny and handsome. Oh, good times.
You drank a lot less whiskey back then, I'd imagine. Is that?
I am built on wine and cheese, my friend. That is my main constituent.
But it was very sharp, and it was very good, and it kind of like, I know these things, but I don't have them readily available for an argument, and it was a good reminder of just like how much of taxation is this circle of like justification for the government's own existence. And so the broad question I was going to ask you is, would you say in its entirety that taxation is theft?
Look, I actually would. And there are different people that try and draw lines in different places. No, actually, sorry, let me correct myself. As my sign says, inflation is theft. Taxation is not theft. Taxation is extortion, right? Theft happens in secret. It happens when you don't know that it's taking place. Extortion is right in front of you. If you lived in Calabrian Italy or in some part of the world run by the Russian mafia or what have you, and you ran a store, sooner or later, someone's going to walk in from the mafia and they're going to say, listen, you need to pay me. And you say, why? Why do I have to pay you money? Because I'm protecting you. Protecting me from what? Protecting you from bad things happening, right? And if you say, listen, mate, nothing bad's happened, I'm not going to pay you, then that night you're going to get broken into. Who by? By the very person that came to you saying you need protection, right? What you're actually paying for is protection from the very people that you're paying. That's what you're paying for. And I can think of no better analogy for taxation. You're paying so that the people that collect the taxes don't come and throw you into jail and lock up and throw away the key, right? That's literally what you're paying for. Taxation is extortion. They are in your face. They literally will say, I work for the Australian Taxation Office. They're proud of the fact that they've got this wonderful, cushy government job. And they'll say, yep, I work for the ATO and I'm here to collect taxes. And if you don't pay me, I'm sending people with guns. And the only reason no one has been shot to death over taxes is because no one has opposed taxes to that degree yet. It's literally just a matter of however far you oppose it, they will use violence and force to enforce it. That's it. End of story. Taxation is extortion. Inflation is theft. That's the one that happens quietly, that you don't see at the time. Only afterwards, you're like, hang on, I've been robbed, right? That's inflation. Taxation is extortion. And I have tried, because I grew up as a conservative, I grew up believing that the government was fundamentally good. You just have to make sure the government is doing the right things, right? Okay, that's how I grew up. I ideologically wrestle with who I even am today. The very idea that I'm sitting here going, good people break bad laws, that is such a departure from who I was as a kid. The fact that I'm sitting here going, yeah, inflation is theft and taxation is extortion. Like, this is such a departure from who I was when I grew up. I wrestle with it. I do. But the reality is, as I look for where that line is, where is that line where it goes from being, slavery? If someone works and you take 100% of all of their productive labor, that's slavery, right? We know that. If you take 0%, that's freedom. Where is the crossover? Where is that point? And I've got to be honest with you, I can't find it. And I've looked. And if you go back to, and Pietro, you and I a moment ago were talking about the Bible, so I apologize to the viewers. I'm going to talk about the Bible a fraction more. You go to 1 Samuel chapter 2, where the children of Israel go to Samuel and say, we want a king. We don't want the system of judges that you gave for us. We want a king. And God says, oh, you want a king? Okay, here's what the king's going to do. The king is going to take 10% of your flocks, 10% of your vineyards, 10% of this, 10% of that, and he will make you his slaves. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, we see in the Old Testament that 10% is equated with slavery.
10% is a pretty good tax rate.
Now, you and I would kill to have a tax rate of only 10%. Right? And Pietro and Max, if you've just watched my Forbidden History of Terrible Taxes video, which is one you were referring to, you'll know that for the average Australian household, more than 50% of our income goes on taxes. 10% would be amazing. 10% in the eyes of God was considered to be slavery.
How do we opt out? Where was the contract we signed at birth to live this life?
The contract, the social contract.
The social contract. Yeah, I'd love to see it.
It's well, and what's interesting is that your video doesn't even inflation then wouldn't have been the talk of everything as it is
Not
now.
Like it is now.
So it's even more than that, because inflation, as we know, is caused by an oversupply of the currency, which is the government printing money to do things that help the government to expand and to justify its own existence, and which then in turn the value of that money that's created is taken from the money that's already in your bank account or in your possession. So that's an extra tax.
It's not rocket surgery, people. If the government prints money, inflation follows. Yeah, got it? Good.
It's the taxation ones, it's like, it really gets me, because as I mentioned before, like a lot of the circles of friends that I swim in, I would consider apolitical entirely.
Sure.
And with them, it's like this notion that death and taxes is one of the most toxic expressions of all time, because it's this kind of acceptance that taxation is inevitable and it's always been this way, and then of course we have to accept it. But if you zoom back even just a little bit, like it's completely immoral, and yet it's the foundation of the people that tell us what to do.
Okay, so I'm wearing the wrong shirt for this conversation. I've got my Good People Break Bad Laws hoodie on. I've got another shirt. What it says is too much 1984, not enough 1776. Now, 1776, of course, was the year of the Boston Tea Party. Now, that was an event that then led to, it wasn't the beginning of, but it led to the beginning of the proper American Revolution against King George, at the time the King of England. He was this little colony that just went to war with the most powerful empire, not military, empire. They had the Navy, they had the military, they had all the resources in the world, and they went to war. And it all kind of started with this Tea Party in 1776. And that Tea Party, if my memory serves me correctly, was over a tax that added up to about 2.5, 2.6, maybe 2.7%. Back in the day, less than 3% was enough to start a war against the strongest empire the earth had ever seen up to that moment in time, arguably stronger than the Roman Empire 2,000 years earlier, right? Today, 50+%. Oh, no, the government's just looking after me. What happened? Sorry, you were saying before the show that you wanted more swearing. What the fuck happened to us? Like, seriously, how did we become this dumb?
This is conflicting, being like a government organization in the Australian Consumers, what is it, ACCC, Australian Consumers
Consumer Competition Commission.
Yeah. Can we report the government for, like, not providing
anti-competitive
a proper product
behavior?
Yeah, exactly.
See, you say that as a joke, Max, but actually that's a really good point, because anti-competitive behavior mostly exists in the form of getting into bed with regulators and getting the government to do your dirty work for you. That's actually the form that most anti-competitive behavior takes.
The more I learn about this world, the more I just want to move to a tropical island somewhere and forget it exists.
Elon Musk has got the right idea. Let's just colonize Mars.
Yep.
All right. I will volunteer. Let's go up there, leave everybody else behind, and deal with their own problems.
What's the tax on Mars? Like three base rocks or something?
Yeah, it better be pretty low.
What you were talking about, the Boston Tea Party as well, their big objection was especially to no taxation without representation. Like that was kind of the saying there. And it's so bizarre as well now, because we have this astronomically higher tax for everything. Like we pay tax on anything that we buy off anyone else with no involvement of the government whatsoever.
I'm sorry, hold that thought. Please don't lose that train of thought. But I'm going to butt in. I find it hilarious when you hear these idiots bleating about how X company doesn't pay tax. Oh, really? You mean they didn't collect GST and remit that to the government? Because I'm pretty sure that would lead to a lawsuit real quick, right? All these companies, whether you like it or not, they're paying at least 10% tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This company didn't pay tax. Good for them.
Oh no, sorry, I didn't laugh at that, Mr. Tax Assessor. No, I would never find such a thought amusing. No.
Yeah, good for them. They didn't contribute to a country which is now, causing wars in the Middle East and pushing the world on the brink of nuclear destruction.
Which is a divisive issue in the libertarian world, but they're funding that, and they're funding all kinds of things that I look at and go, really? I am now funding all of those things via my government. Like, how? Like, can I be a conscientious objector, please?
Yeah,
that's like if the government got out of a whole bunch of those areas, well, then maybe I'd lose my argument. But for as long as they're funding those things that I personally find really conscientiously objectionable, can I just opt out as a conscientious objector until they get out of those things, please?
It's a lack of consent that gets me. I mean, I don't know the correct way to go about this. Don't want referendums on every single issue in the world, but
sure,
put out a survey or something. Like, what should we pay tax on? Let's all actually agree on it.
Yeah.
Just to even have more of a direct say over where the money gets spent. I mean, when you get your tax return in Australia, they have a pie graph that tells you where your money went, and it's not very granular. Like, it's very broad categories. Excuse me, as I guess it kind of has to be. There's probably no other way to do it. But even so, to have some say and to be able to say, you know what, I'm not that worried about X, Y, and Z issues. I really want my money to go into roads and healthcare. But we have no power over that. All we have is the ability to choose who we vote for. But let's be honest, that's Tweedledee and Tweedledum. I mean, we've got the Victorian election coming up. I don't know when you're going to release this, but when we're recording it, the Victorian election is only a couple of days away. We've got Tweedledee and Tweedledum. We just had the debate between the Matthew Guy and Daniel Andrews. And the only thing that I could think of watching this debate is, are you serious? Are these the best two human beings that we could come up with out of a state of 6.5 fucking million people? Is this the best we can do? Right?
so this was my exact point that I've still got stuck in here that I'd put on pause from before, is that, the no taxation without representation. Okay, what is this representation that I'm paying this huge amount for? Is it the fact that at the end of the day, as you said, I get to pick between Tweedledee and Tweedledum? My vote doesn't actually come anywhere near making a difference anyway. It's not like I have any actual say in how my local community is how it's run or anything. It's this, like vote that decides between two people that I find both abhorrent. So it's, what is this extra money that we're paying for? It's all for nothing. And if you were to talk about the pie graph of where the taxes go, and if that was honest, 80% of that would just be bureaucrats and,
correct.
Foreign weapons companies or, big pharma or something like that.
That's actually a really good point, Pietro, because what they do is they break it down by category, but within the category, they don't actually tell you how much of that money went to productive work versus how much of that money was just consumed in the churn of bureaucracy. That's actually a really good point. And like, I'm going to say it again. I've said it twice already. I'm going to say it a third time. It's a really good point. Don't get fooled by the categories. Don't get fooled by the government saying to you, we're spending $1 billion on XYZ. No, they're not. They're spending $500 million on bureaucratic jobs of people that are guaranteed to vote for them next election. And only the other 500 million is actually going to go towards anything productive. And even then, it's questionable how valuable it will be.
Is there a way we can derive this information, even through like freedom of information, like just how much is actually going to red tape and bureaucracy? Because it would be beneficial for our cause if we could actually nail down these stats and pump that out in our own pie graph.
Look, I don't know, but I would point you to the Australian Taxpayers Alliance that do fantastic work. Set up by Tim Andrews and John Humphreys. Tim Andrews, unfortunately, has gone to the US since then. I think they're now run by Gabe Buckley, if my information is correct. They would be the go-to people, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, to try and actually discern, do we have information on this or not? And if we don't, they're probably the people that are best placed to know who to ask and what questions to ask to try and get that information.
While we're on the topic of the state election, the imminent state election, just to change it up a little bit.
Sure.
Predictions, Topher. What are we thinking? Obviously, there's quite a few options at play. There's Labor win, Andrews loses his seat. Andrews wins his seat, Labor lose.
Well, you are aware, I'm going to preface this, you are aware that the difference between a professional political commentator versus just an amateur at the pub is that the professional can tell you afterwards why they were wrong. Right? That's the difference. They're all wrong, but the professional can tell you why afterwards. So predicting politics is a fool's game. Let me be a fool for a moment. There are some really encouraging signs, and those encouraging signs started a few months ago when Daniel Andrews simply disappeared out of the public eye. This, for me, is one of the most interesting indicators of all of them. Daniel Andrews, we know the Labor Party have relentless polling going, focus groups, polling 24/7. They don't stop. They're constantly, they've got that finger to the wind, constantly trying to discern, what do people think? What do people want? Are we on the right side? Are we on the wrong side? Is this popular? Is this not? The fact that Daniel Andrews didn't show up to the AFL Grand Final, the fact that Daniel Andrews hasn't shown up to his own polling booth, the pre-polling booth in Mulgrave, not even for a photo opportunity, right? 15 minutes, show up, get a photo, fuck off. Hasn't done it, to my knowledge. I might be wrong, but to my knowledge, hasn't done it. This is really telling. It indicates to me that what the Labor Party polls are telling the Labor Party insiders is that if he shows up, it's a risk. He could get someone who has a really negative reaction and says something, and it's caught on camera and it goes viral. Just like what happened when he went in front of a synagogue. There were only about 30 or so hand-picked people. These were not 30 randoms. These were 30 hand-picked people. And one of them still had to go at Daniel Andrews.
One thing I've always said is I will never vote for a politician who can't show their face in public, because it says a lot about the job they've done. And
he can't show his face in public. And this is really interesting to me. So that's the data point number one. that I find really compelling. Now, the polls are saying that Daniel Andrews is going to win even now, 53% to 47. That's a pretty convincing margin.
Is that Daniel Andrews' seat, or is that Labor over?
No, that's across the state.
Yeah,
53% to 47. If I remember rightly, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what I read earlier today. I read stuff every day. Stuff gets jumbled. But if I'm remembering rightly, it's 53 to 47. Statewide, two-party preferred, Labor versus Liberal. Now, that should be a compelling win. That's a convincing win. 53%, that's a convincing win. Why is he not showing his face in public then, if he's got such a margin? There's this real, who do you believe? Now, I've got this policy. You believe actions over words, and you believe money over actions. Now, in this case, we can't see the money. We don't know what donations are coming in, who's supporting whose campaigns, etc. So the highest level of authenticity we have is actions, and Daniel Andrews' actions tell us that he is not popular in the electorate. That's what his actions tell us. Now, does that mean he's going to lose? Not necessarily, but let me add another data point. There is exit polling suggesting, so exit polling basically is where people on their way out of a polling booth will tell you who they voted for. Now, there's two layers of lie here. There's two layers of concern. Number one is the question of who is more likely to tell you what they did. It's going to be inherently the person who's more proud of what they did, the person who feels better about what they did. My wife and I were in the US in 2016 prior to the election of Donald Trump. And it was fascinating because we saw Hillary yard signs everywhere. And when we talked to people, and we'd be just be in a restaurant, we'd be talking to the person who's serving, right? No, like a nothing conversation with the person who's serving. That's all it was. If they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton, they would bring it up. We didn't have to bring it up. They would tell us that they're a Hillary Clinton supporter. But if they were voting for Donald Trump, they would say nothing about politics. And then we, because we kind of knew the game and we were interested, we would then say, hey, we're Australians. Like, we don't really know what's going on. Like, what's this business between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton? Who do you think is going to win? And what would happen, and I'm not joking, I'm not exaggerating, the server, this waiter or waitress serving tables in a restaurant would look over their shoulder to make sure no one could hear them. And they would lower their voice and they would say to us, actually, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Right?
Well, they dubbed it the silent majority, didn't they?
That's right. And right there in 2016, before the election had happened, when my wife and I came back to Australia, we were saying to anyone who would listen, Donald Trump is going to win. Why? Because the people voting for Donald Trump aren't saying they're going to vote for Donald Trump out there in public. What that means is the polls are wrong. Okay? Self-selection bias. The Hillary voter, when they get a call from a pollster who says, hey, I'm doing polling about the election, they are going to say, yeah, I'm voting for Hillary Clinton, because they're proud of it and they want the world to know. The Trump voter is like, nah, hang up.
So two-party preferred poll, if you say it was 53 to 47, there's every chance it could be more like, 45 to 55 in Liberal favor.
Yeah. Who knows? But the reason why I bring it up is in relation to exit polling. You have to ask yourself the question, what is the psychology of the voter? Is a Daniel Andrews voter, I was going to say Daniel Trump. Wow. Is a Daniel Andrews voter, there's some personality similarity. Is a Daniel Andrews voter going to stop for the exit poller and give them an answer, or are they not? I don't know. But there's a margin for error that has to be allowed there. Second to that, when they answer, do they tell the truth? There are some people in the world, in the words of Batman, who just want to watch the world burn. Actually, that was Alfred, not Batman. That was Alfred's PA person. It was Batman's PA person. Some people just want to watch the world burn. And so when they do stop to talk to an exit pollster, they're going to lie just for shits and giggles. There's another swear word for you guys. Just for shits and giggles, right? So this exit polling has to be taken with a massive grain of salt. That's my point, right? There are two layers of dishonesty there. There is the self-selection bias. Who wants to talk about who they voted for? Then there's the honesty. Who's actually going to tell me what really happened versus who's just going to shit stir because they know it doesn't really matter and they can fuck with people, right? However, the exit polling at Mulgrave is indicating that Ian Cook, who is an independent who is running against Daniel Andrews, is polling really well.
And the people who are voting for him are going to be proud and admitting it.
You would think so. However, that introduces the opportunity for bias. If 50% of the Daniel Andrews voters are just going to walk past, no, I don't want to talk to you. But 100% of the Ian Cook voters are going to be, I voted for Ian Cook. That means your exit poll is not going to be accurate, right? We have to take this into account. If anything, I think the exit poll is probably more optimistic from my point of view, as an Ian Cook supporter. As someone who wants to see Daniel Andrews lose his seat, my gut tells me that the exit polls are going to be more optimistic than the reality of what's actually going into the ballot box. But there's a really interesting thing about this where Daniel Andrews does not want to go out in public. The exit polls at Mulgrave are telling us that Ian Cook's doing really well. Now, Ian Cook by himself doesn't have to come over the top of Daniel Andrews. What he needs is the preferences from the Liberal Party candidate, Michael
Pietrino, is that
Pietrino, something like that. Thank you. It's not quite Pietro. That's why I was hung up. I was like, hang on, am I just thinking of Pietro's name here? Yeah, Pietrino, something like that.
Well, his head of vote card has Ian Cook at number 2, doesn't it?
Correct. And Daniel Andrews' card has Ian Cook at number 6.
Yeah.
And the people in between him and Ian Cook are meaningless.
So
placeholders.
Wow.
So what's really interesting here is if Ian Cook is in the final 3, there's every chance he will be the winner.
I would imagine it's too difficult for the second and third to be Dan. Dan would be down to the last 2 regardless. It has to be Ian,
very
or
likely
the Liberal guy that gets knocked out.
Can you imagine the situation, the scenario where it's Pietrino versus Cook?
So
Andrews gets him over the line.
Here's my prediction, though. Okay, you asked me for a prediction. Predictions are a fool's game. Let me be a fool for a moment.
No, we're taking money on this.
I think that there is a very real chance of Daniel Andrews losing his seat, even if Labor don't lose government.
That to me would be the most exciting thing.
That'd be amazing because the statement that it makes, it's a very specific statement. Now, the Labor Party as a whole have been terrible because they've fallen in behind Daniel Andrews. They haven't stood up to him. He's been, in my opinion, he's been the worst human rights abuser in my lifetime in Australia. However, what it says, if Daniel Andrews loses his seat, but Labor hold power, is so specific and it's so focused on Daniel Andrews that I almost want that.
It would also be an indictment on the Liberal Party. We hated Daniel Andrews and Labor so much, and yet you were not useful enough to even warrant getting to be.
They're not being rewarded for being such a failure of an opposition.
I watched parts of the debate. Was it last night, the night before? It's all blurred into one. Time has blurred into this continuous muck of fuckery. It's just awful. But I watched it and I just sat there and I went, is this the best we can do? Are these 2 people supposedly the cream of the crop of 6.5 million of us? Like, okay, I get that I am not premier material. I completely accept that. If I worked really hard on all of my many flaws and focused and learned the right things, and maybe in 20 years I could become premier material, but it would take a fuckload of work, okay? I accept that premier material is not a dime a dozen. It's not an everyday thing. But out of 6.5 million of us, Daniel Andrews and Matthew Guy is the best we can come up with. We are fucked.
I think that says a lot about our democracy on a greater scale. It doesn't really exist, does it?
How can it come down to those 2? And it has echoes, and I mentioned it a moment ago. It has echoes of the Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton election in the US. Like, how can it come down to these two?
Mm.
Like, why are you asking me to pick a side between Hillary Clinton, the ineffectual warmonger, and Donald Trump, the egomaniac? Like, how are you asking me to pick a side between these two fucksticks? And I really feel the same about this Victorian election. Daniel Andrews, one of the, no, not one of, sorry, let me correct myself. The worst human rights abuser in Australian power in my lifetime, right? I'm going to be unequivocal about it. The worst. Versus Matthew Guy, one of the most ineffectual, nothing human beings in politics in my lifetime. And I say that having seen the Victorian Liberal Party be ineffectual for my entire lifetime, right? I mean, they've been terrible. They've been worse than terrible. And yet Matthew Guy still stands out as a complete nothing.
I think this
How
is
did we come to this?
It's a pessimistic way to look at it, what I'm about to say, but it's probably the most appropriate way to analyze it. When you say choosing between those two or choosing between Clinton and Trump, and how a lot of people are voting now, you're not choosing who you like. You're choosing who you hate least. And a lot of people, instead of voting one down to the bottom, they're working backwards. Who do I hate the most? Yet they'll go 14th on my ballot paper, and you work way up to who you hate the least.
Max, you're preaching my language. One of the things I used to say to people when I was in the US in 2016, prior to the election between Trump and Hillary Clinton, when I met someone who was a Democratic supporter, I would say to them, "Oh, this is fascinating. Thank you so much. And, I really hope that Hillary wins." Just saying that, obviously, but
because if you didn't say that, she might send someone to kill you.
Could you please tell me why someone should vote for Hillary without mentioning Trump? That was the challenge, right? Tell me why Hillary is so good, not why Trump is so bad. I can tell you that of probably 15 people that I put that challenge to in our month in the US, 15 people would be about right. Not a single person could do it. Every single one of them stumbled. They could tell you why Trump was bad. They couldn't tell you why Hillary Clinton was good without referring to Trump. And the same is happening now in Daniel Andrews' Victoria. Lots of people can tell you why Daniel Andrews is bad, but can they make the case for Matthew Guy without referring to Daniel Andrews? Most of them can't. And in fact, actually, sorry, let me rephrase that, not from most of them. So far, I have not had anyone make a successful case for Matthew Guy without referring to Daniel Andrews. Not one.
Yeah, I'd echo that. In even what I saw at the federal is that the Liberal Party on the ground kind of volunteers and supporters are, yes, disappointed, because I think the betrayal of the Liberal Party's failure is a betrayal of its base. Yes. Whereas the Labor Party's failure,
values. It's a betrayal of its values.
Yes, of the values of its base. And whereas the Labor Party's failures are purely because they're going in line with the values of their base, which causes failure, right? And so the Liberal supporters, volunteers, and whatever that I spoke to were like, I'd love to be a bit more idealistic like you are, but we can't have Albanese, and now we can't have Andrews, and it's this lesser of two evils, which which as libertarians we're sick of. It feels nice to win every now and again in the blue versus red game, but it's actually doing nothing.
Yeah, so I've recently I've subscribed to the Daily Wire. Do you follow the Daily Wire?
Yeah. I know them, Jordan.
Very much conservative. They're not libertarian at all. They are conservative, right? That's an important distinction, right? But Jeremy Boring, the CEO of the Daily Wire, has this great phrase: "You win by winning." And this is something that I think libertarians could learn from. We are so used to playing the bridesmaid. We're so used to being the runner-up. We're so used to being the one where we can make the sophisticated Asperger argument, right? For the people that are actually going to sit there for long enough to read the information to go, oh, I get it now, of why we were the better option, but we still fucking lost, right? And I'm done with that. I'm really sick of that. We win by winning, not by being the bridesmaid. Now, okay, we need to be realistic about where we're at. In this election in Victoria, what does winning look like? Well, winning looks like holding the balance of power in the upper house. We're not about to have a premier that is a libertarian. I'm sorry, we're not the UAP. We're not going to promise you that Craig Kelly is going to be the prime minister. Okay, we're not going to lie to you the way that some parties are willing to do when election time comes around. But what winning would look like for us is David Limbrick, Tim Quilty, and maybe one or two others getting up in the upper house and holding that balance of power. That would be what winning looks like. I love what The Age published the other day. Have you guys seen this?
That was published quite a while ago, and it's only resurfaced recently. Yeah. That was that's an old graph, but yeah,
well, I'll pop this graphic up on screen for those.
Yeah, please do, because I didn't even know about this until recently. It was only when it resurfaced that I discovered it for the first time. That it was David Limbrick and Tim Quilty from the Liberal Democratic Party that have actually been the staunchest opposition of Daniel Andrews in the upper house. Not even the Liberal Party, the supposed opposition, have actually opposed Daniel Andrews as often as David Limbrick and Tim Quilty. Now, here's the funny thing. David Limbrick and Tim Quilty are not opposition for reflexive opposition's sake, the way that the Liberals are. They're principled people that assess every piece of legislation against a set of principles. Does this reduce taxes? Does this reduce red tape? Does this increase freedom? These are the questions that they're asking themselves. And yet they manage to come out as opposing Daniel Andrews more often than the so-called opposition party that opposes Daniel Andrews for sport, for fun, to make a point to their base, to do fundraising. They'll oppose Daniel Andrews for any reason at all. And yet it was David Limbrick and Tim Quilty that actually came out on top as the most consistent opponents of Daniel Andrews. And I want to be clear about this. They weren't opponents of Daniel Andrews for the sake of opposing Daniel Andrews. They were opponents of Daniel Andrews because they were standing up for freedom, for individual liberty, and for the rights that each and every one of us ought to hold, but under this government, we don't. And I just find it so fascinating that here are these two individuals from some micro party that no one had ever really paid attention to before they managed to get two people elected at the last Victorian election, that these are the people that, according to The Age, a left-wing publication, have emerged as the true opposition in this state. I think that is so telling and so important. And I think what we ought to do in this coming election, if I can just segue to that for a second, is return David Limbrick and return Tim Quilty to their seats, because I think they've done a freaking good job, and add Mayor Tessa and add a bunch of these others in these other seats where they are. Yeah, that's right. Who have you got? Julia McGrath. Add Julia McGrath, right? Because these are people that are going to stand on their principles. And principles, this is what we said before, that pragmatic, outcome-oriented politics versus the principles-based politics. Principles-based politics almost has gone extinct. It almost doesn't exist anymore. And it's really only the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. These are the only two parties that are still making their decisions on their principles. And the question for you as a voter is, whose principles do you agree with? And if you don't agree with the Greens' principles, well, you probably better get on board with the Liberal Democrats. Just saying.
Well, that's always been our biggest issue, is getting the message out and getting people on board. And we've spoken about it before, but the general level of voter intellect is sadly not that high.
Now, look, let's
not to insult people.
That's right. Let's not be insulting towards the average intellect. There's a thing called rational ignorance, right? Where people choose not to pay attention to something because it makes sense not to pay attention to it, because the amount of time invested to understand it would never repay itself in any kind of dividends on the other end. And politics is an area where most people can actually be rationally ignorant. It makes sense to say, you know what, I'm not going to invest the time. I'm not going to spend time understanding this and finding out about it, because it'll never repay itself. It'll never come back to me in dividends.
It will over generations.
It will over generations, but most of us don't think in generations.
It's
So
that planting the trees that you'll never see type of thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I get that. I'm wholeheartedly on board with that. I lived that for 2.5 years with Daniel Andrews here in Victoria and all the protests and everything else. But the reality is, for most people, that's not where they're at. And so I can understand rational ignorance. I think we need to be a bit more kind, I think, to the people that we're trying to reach out to and the people that we want to try and engage. And so I understand why you've not paid attention up to this point in time. But would you listen to me for a moment while I tell you why we need to pay attention, regardless?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the purpose of our existence, right? Is to get to the people who would otherwise choose that rational ignorance.
Yeah.
I am conscious we are well and truly past the hour mark.
Okay, Pietro, I'm sorry to cut you off again. My record is 5 hours and 5 minutes. Anything less than that is weak.
Your viewers are much more interested in hearing what you have to say. Well, I suppose our viewers will be listening to you tonight. So,
Topher, you vortex a bottle of wine, a bottle of whiskey, and we'll get to 5 hours. If you can stand through that, I will commit to 4 more hours of this podcast.
All
right. Well, it's gonna be you two. Before we do wrap up, were there any last thoughts that you wanted to leave us with before we head towards the election of our lifetimes? Or
look, I can't resist the opportunity for shameless self-promotion, and that's going to come in the form of saying, if you have not seen Battleground Melbourne, the documentary, you need to see it. It's free. You can watch it at battlegroundmelbourne.com. That's it. Just type in battlegroundmelbourne.com. It's right there. You don't have to give me your email address. You don't have to do anything. You just watch it. And then what you do is you copy the link and you send it to everyone you know, and you post it on social media. If every Victorian watched Battleground Melbourne before the election on Saturday, there is no way Daniel Andrews and the Labor Party would get back in, because they would watch it and go, that's right, I remember. Like, there's so much that we've forgotten. There are 2 key pieces of feedback that I get from people after they watch Battleground Melbourne. Number one is, damn, I'd forgotten so much. Like, I lived it. I was there for it, but actually my brain had just pushed it to one side. And number 2 is, I forgot how crazy it was. Right? That's the other piece of feedback. I forgot how crazy we shut down playgrounds. 5-year-olds couldn't swing on a swing because Daniel Andrews said, like, I forgot that. People got shot with rubber bullets because they were doing their shopping on Elizabeth Street in the city on the wrong day. I forgot that, right? Battlegroundmelbourne.com. It'll change your life. I've watched it change the lives of so many others. Just 2.5 months ago, the senior pastor of my church, who was on the wrong side of history for most of COVID, right? Shut down his church, did all the things he was told. 10 weeks ago, he watched Battleground Melbourne. It changed his life. The switch was instant. It was total. It was complete. The very next Sunday that I was at church, he had me up the front telling people how to watch Battleground Melbourne. It changed his life. And as a result, it's changed the life of the entire congregation. So can I encourage you, if you have not already, watch Battleground Melbourne, battlegroundmelbourne.com. Watch it, pass it on. Every single person that we have watched this in Victoria before the election is a vote that will not go to Daniel Andrews.
And just to attest to that, even if you have seen it before, like, I watched the live premiere in January and then didn't view it again until the screening came to Ballarat, watched it at the cinemas. I hadn't forgotten too much of what had happened, but the emotions came back to me. Mm. And, you know, it's quite sad and intense remembering didn't forget what happened, but just remembering how it made me feel.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. I'm with you there, Max. It is intense, but probably the third piece of feedback that I've had, so, you know, number 1 is I've forgotten so much. Number 2 is I've forgotten how bad it was. Number 3 is actually people saying thank you. because somehow seeing it all in documentary form, and especially watching it in the cinema, which we don't have any more cinema showings planned, but we did a cinema run just now all over Victoria, and people would come up to me afterwards and give me a hug. And I had one person in particular, he said to me, I want to say thank you to you, because without you, I wouldn't be alive today. And I said, I hope you don't mean that literally. He said, no, I do. I actually mean that literally. I was at that point, and then I came across you. This was back, in 2021. But Battleground Melbourne, so many people have said to me afterwards, they watch it and they say that it helped them to move on. It helped them with that healing process and processing things and figuring out, we've got so many conflicting feelings from that era, from that couple of years of our lives. And Battleground Melbourne just helps people to process that. So for your own sake, battlegroundmelbourne.com, but then send it to everyone you know, because honestly, anyone that watches it, I'll promise you 80% of those people are not going to vote for Daniel Andrews. And the 20% that will, well, they were always rusted on. They were always rusted on, right? But 80% of people, once they watch Battleground Melbourne, they're not going to vote for Daniel Andrews.
And and the 20% that might have gained some perspective into what the rest of us were talking about all along.
Yeah.
While we're plugging, we'll put all the links to Battleground Melbourne and Topher's various social media presences in the description. Follow us on Instagram, like us on Spotify, and subscribe to us on YouTube. Thank you so much for your time, Topher.
Oh, look, Pietro, my pleasure. And if you don't follow these guys, then you hate freedom.
Perfect. We'll end on that.
That can be our first testimonial.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Topher.
Cheers.